Hello and welcome to the MikoBits show, and I'm your host, MikoBits. I've got an exciting show for you today with Kyle Kistner, who is from the BZX DeFi Protocol. So very exciting. I'm very happy to be here. I just wanted to let people know that this video program is information and entertainment purposes only. It's not intended to be investment advice, so seek a licensed professional for investment advice. So today we're talking about DeFi, and we're talking about one of these new exciting protocols, BZX. It's actually pretty established now, and it's quite an exciting one. So I think before we get into it, just a quick message. Before we start, if you're interested in Bitcoin and blockchain, please consider clicking that subscribe button and also click the bell so you can get notifications about future videos that I might post. Thank you. Okay, Kyle Kistner, welcome to the MikoBits show.
Thanks for having me, Miko.
Absolutely, it's terrific. So first of all, would love to just hear a little bit about how did you get involved in blockchain?
Yeah, so when I was in undergraduate and university back in about 2011, I was, I guess, growing up, I used to play this video game called Diablo 2.
Diablo
Back
2.
when I was 14. And I got really interested in kind of like the reverse engineering and security aspects of kind of like hacking and breaking the game.
That's amazing.
Whatnot. And so I made a bunch of friends who were really active in the security and cryptography communities, who were kind of like more old school cypherpunks and all of that. So pretty much like very, very soon when Bitcoin came out, people I hung around with online were already talking about it. In 2011, they were saying, buy Bitcoin or you're literally an idiot. And and so, I got very interested in the underlying technology, the blockchain, because I felt like, Bitcoin was kind of interesting on its own, but I wasn't really convinced by the value prop that was presented in the white paper.
Peer-to-peer electronic cash.
Yeah, every time I tried to reason about it, it kind of seemed like there was this friction from going between fiat to Bitcoin that would ultimately hinder adoption with merchants. So I wasn't really convinced about Bitcoin, but I was convinced about blockchain. And I remember kind of like proselytizing to people saying, hey, this guy should win a Nobel Prize for coming up with this blockchain technology. This is really something. And I started seeing like Namecoin, Peercoin, these colored coins. And when I wrapped my mind around the notion of colored coins, it was like it blew my mind.
Yeah, that's
in
big.
An incredible way. I was just like plastered to the back of the room. And I started following that, and I was very excited about it. And then somebody told me about this project that was a white paper at the time called Ethereum. And they said that, it was basically generalizing the concept. And I read the white paper, and I remember it was like I saw the light of God. Here's
the thing, right? With colored coins, with extensibility, programmable money, like I get it, right? Like it's definitely like a bunch of light bulbs flashing off. But the thing that's so funny is that the Austrian economist Mises says that all economic activity flows from dissatisfaction. That's basically his model, right? And so when I look at a white paper, I'm always looking at what I call the problem solution dyad. That's what I'm always looking at. So whenever I pick up a white paper, I'm always like problem solution dyad. And I'm always looking at like, does the problem represent a fundamental economic dissatisfaction, right? A dissatisfaction that produces like activity, right? That's my feeling. And so I love Ethereum, but the economic dissatisfaction expressed in the white paper is we don't have a world computer dissatisfaction. Which so to me, it's kind of like the paper is like maybe 8 out of 10, but the protocol's a 10 out of 10. So like that's my vibe.
So I guess like at that time, I was very much digging the aesthetic aspects of the blockchain. So
Yeah.
I've always been sort of politically inclined to this like authority and centralization and whatnot. And the idea of nobody in charge just appealed to me on such a basic level that like for me that was all I really needed. Like there wasn't like this further concept of economic
Yeah.
dissatisfaction. I was just like
It's very
nobody
interesting.
in charge.
It's interesting what you're describing, right? Because actually, there's some kind of Russian scholars like Kropotkin that actually established this kind of natural order of anarchism, right? So there's definitely kind of a history of this kind of fundamentally decentralized governance that kind of has this quality to it that's fascinating. But especially as we start dealing with kind of more and more authoritarian government styles and centralization today. But I guess what I wanted to flash back to is actually your comment about Diablo. I was actually during CoinDesk Consensus, back when they were still holding it in person. I was on this boat, and it was kind of this protest boat. And the reason why is because Vitalik was in a fight with Consensus with CoinDesk, right? And so he refused to attend, but he didn't refuse to be on a boat that was kind of orbiting in the harbor in the river, in the Hudson River. So we basically rode around on this boat, and he said something really funny. Is Vitalik said that everything I ever needed to know about pump and dump groups I learned on the auction house selling netherweave cloth, right? Which is a direct reference to, of course, World of Warcraft, which is sort of a great granddaddy multiplayer online game. And he even said that his main was a gnome warlock, which entertained me to no end, because when I was playing World of Warcraft, that was what I was also playing. But the thing that's very entertaining is actually these linkages, right? These linkages. But I think your background's fascinating because not only gaming, right? Because gaming sometimes connects to things like economics, right? But because it creates these kind of model economies. But the other dimension is actually cybersecurity, right? And obviously, cybersecurity is such a big part of the phenomenon. So especially if you're working at it at the level of cryptographic primitives and at the sort of not the base layer, but the next layer up, right? The application layer, which is where you are building DeFi applications. So that's really exciting. Any last kind of riffing on any of these topics?
Yeah, I played a human warlock, and I also
What
cornered
is
the
it with
netherweave market.
warlocks?
I cornered the netherweave market on that auction house. I had so much, like, I didn't play the game. I just traded on the auction house.
It
That
was
was my
just economics. You were only interested in the economics. It's really funny. Like it feels like warlocks is sort of a DeFi like oriented class. So I'm with you. It's me, you, and Vitalik. Like it's funny stuff. So what I'd love to do is get you to talk a little bit about BZX. So if you're going to introduce BZX, like how would you describe it?
Yeah, so BZX is a decentralized margin trading, lending, and borrowing platform. Our unique value proposition is that we are basically the only generalized DeFi trading platform out there. So, there are like some others that do lending, there are some others that do borrowing, there's some others that do trading, but there's nobody who really fills the niche of just kind of like a generalized trading platform for a wide variety of assets. And so that's sort of the spot that we filled in the market. And we have some other things about us that are peculiar, and like the way that we liquidate people, and there's some efficiencies that we have there. But I would say, basically we're the generalized margin trading platform. So if you want to come, you can think of, like DYDX as kind of like being like the Coinbase and us as the Binance. of DEX trading, something like that.
Wow, that's really interesting. So how does that metaphor work? Like, like in terms of how would you expand on those specific differences?
Yeah, so like our approach is more oriented towards like a greater variety of assets.
Yeah, like a
And
Binance.
yeah, exactly. Whereas, like others are more concentrated on just like maybe ETH, DAI, USDC, and things like that. So I would say like, you know, that's basically the gist of it. If you want to come, you want to short link, you want to go long on link, and you want to do it in
I
just a
want a
few
short link.
we're the place to do it. And so yeah, I mean, unfortunately, they're also our Oracle provider. So if you're shorting them while our Oracle is providing it, that's it's kind of a
They seem to
interesting
be
conundrum.
the Oracle provider of reference, right? Because I was just actually talking with Stani from Aave, and he said, "Yeah, we're also using Chainlink. We do." He said we're building our own oracles as well. So it seems like that seems to be the standard position, which is a lot of people are like, well, we're going to use Chainlink, but we're also doing our own thing. So that seems to be a standard industry posture.
Yeah, I think when we first announced that we were relaunching and kind of like what our plans were going forward, we put out this idea of a multi-oracle system, and it does seem like there was a lot of mind share that was attracted to that idea. But it's also it's a complex problem, and the more pieces you add, the more complexity, the more points of
Totally agree.
failure you add. So we're looking at that very cautiously. For sure, right now, Chainlink is the oracle that has secured the greatest amount of value for the greatest amount of time. And so, if you can look at security audits, you can look at various different models, but at the end of the day, the best metric for security is just how much are you responsible for, and for how long. And that's like kind of the bottom line metric we're looking for. So
Yeah, that's
you know,
that's why that's why Ethereum is like such a well trusted protocol, right? Because of its age and because of the total amount of value that's inside of that ecosystem, right? And it turns out that when you talk about colored coins or tokenization on top of ETH, like the total value that's been on top of ETH is actually greater than the total value of ETH, right? So that's a amazing transcendent moment for the platform.
yeah, maybe even a little concerning as we go over to proof of stake, because in theory you want the value of the like the value securing the network to be in excess of the value that's on top of it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. It's a little bit like a boat with like too much cargo.
yeah, it's a victim of it. It could possibly be a victim of its own success, but it's a good problem to have. Just like network congestion, if your network is highly congested, it means there's too many people using it, which is a good place to start
But
because
one thing that's potentially less problematic is that actually the vast majority of token value is actually so-called stablecoins on top of ETH, right? The ETH derived stablecoins are actually the majority of the value, which is amazing to see. Although if you kind of hang out on CoinMarketCap, like you can see that it's really actually not even that many that represent most of the value, right? You can just kind of look at that pretty transparently. But I guess kind of coming back, like it's a fascinating thing you're talking about with BZX. So I guess what I'd love to understand is sort of how do you see kind of the current state of the art? Like we talked about, obviously oracles, it's a thorny area, but like how do you see broadly speaking the DeFi movement? Right, we've been kind of alluding to kind of Ethereum scalability and issues about the platform, but like where are we?
where are we right now?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I guess where are we? Right now, we're in the middle of the yield farming craze,
Yes.
where people are piling in to different DeFi protocols, and they're trying to use it and trying to make money using it. I think right now we're definitely in an experimentation phase where we're seeing various levels of success in implementing those yield farming incentive mechanisms. So, you see something like Compound
Yep.
that was already highly liquid and already like one of the biggest protocols around. And they instituted yield farming, and it was a super interesting idea and a huge contribution to the space that kind of kickstarted this entire thing. But you also see that like Compound does sometimes fall victim to being first on some things.
Yeah.
So there was definitely some unexpected outcomes as a result of instituting it the way that
But
they did.
not as unexpected as like Maker Die Black Thursday though.
Yeah, yeah. But I think, certainly they did not succeed in incentivizing exactly the kind of activity they seem to be looking for. And I think, Robert expressed as much because, they didn't see they weren't really trying to get people to like loop around with DAI over and over again.
You know what it reminds me of is there was this one sort of Chinese exchange called F Coin. Do you remember this sucker? So
Yeah, it was like a mirror to BitMax back in the day.
yeah, it was really funny because I was talking with a guy from Balancer, and he mentioned F Coin, right? And it's so funny because like when you think about F Coin, like I instantly kind of think about the F word, and it's kind of entertaining because they created an incentive for decentralized wash trading. Right. They basically said, if you use our exchange, we're going to give you a reward in our own token. And what happened was that people would they would just pump in a circle, right? They would use their Bitcoin to buy tethers, and they'd use their tethers to buy Bitcoin just to yield farm. So the thing that's so funny is that that's kind of a precedent, right? It's a precedent for DeFi yield farming, but it's completely centralized, right? It's completely not decentralized, right? But the incentive mechanisms are very similar to venture capital companies who are delivering like food delivery, right? And they just use venture capital to kind of subsidize like food delivery, and it gets really comical, right? So I guess my question to you is kind of is that really where we're at, like in this kind of comedy stage where like people are overfunding incentives, or what is that?
Well, so yeah, I think, with Compound, Robert wasn't sitting there thinking, how can I get people to loop DAI around in a circle over and over again? But,
that wasn't his plan.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But, we did see, like, subsequently, we saw Balancer institute almost like what people viewed as almost identical, but like it was subtly different. And like, when you look at lending protocols, there's actually they almost bootstrap themselves in terms of liquidity. When we first started Fulcrum, we put, there was like in total around maybe 750K worth of liquidity in the entire thing.
Sure.
And it started taking off on its own all the way up to 20 million. And it was moving
How big is it now?
Now it's so it's back down to 750K.
Oh, okay.
But when you look at something like Balancer, it's actually a completely different ballgame, because with something like Balancer, it's closer to an exchange. Yep. And when you have an exchange, you get network effects from incentivizing that liquidity. Liquidity begets liquidity, which has more people trade. The more trading that happens causes more people to deposit liquidity, and it causes a virtuous cycle. So we see, the virtuous cycle exists on its own. Uniswap has it.
Yep.
But when you're somebody like Balancer, you're having to not just fight against the network effects of centralized exchanges, but you're also fighting against the network effects of decentralized exchanges like Uniswap, which does have in many ways a very similar value proposition. So how do you climb this hill? How do you achieve this kind of activation energy? How do you catalyze this sort of critical mass?
And it's so interesting what's happening too, because if you think about it, like something like a Balancer is actually super elegant from the perspective of liquidity provisioning infrastructure, right? But one of the fascinating things that we're seeing emerging in DeFi are aggregators, right? So if you look at something like 1inch, like 1inch is actually starting to develop almost like a Binance kind of reputation, just because it sort of meta aggregates, right? So that, as far as like, oh, like what about the availability of obscure DeFi token X, and if you're looking for obscure DeFi token X, like an aggregator is more likely to have inventory than any individual infrastructure, right? So it's fascinating kind of seeing the evolution of this.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing is that like that yield farming might not be the most appropriate thing ever for a lending protocol, especially a lending protocol that already has liquidity. So, for example, we have our own liquidity mining program that's very similar but different in some ways, in some fairly critical ways. So, what we're doing is we're targeting the people who generate cash flows. So we believe that generating cash flows is the economically useful thing
Great.
for the protocol and the people who own the protocol. So when our program goes into effect, it's going to target, it give you liquidity mining rewards based on the cash flows that you're generating. And it's only going to be doing that for about 3 months. Because the way we see it, our protocol is relaunching. And on relaunch, we will, have quite a need for liquidity. We'll have to bootstrap it up from the bottom again.
Yeah.
And so, in that case, liquidity mining as a very short-term measure makes a lot of sense. So we were able to kind of see what others were doing and learn from what they did and maybe kind of tweak it so that we can actually get the kind of outcomes we want. We hope that we don't see people just like looping through or just like opening loans and then closing them opening.
I think way back in the like 1950s, banks would hand out toasters for opening a new account, right? So if you open an account, you would actually get like a physical toaster for like making toast, and obviously like that gets subject to toaster farming, where people can go in and out of the bank. They can come back wearing a mustache, and they could be like, I'd like to open a new account, and they get another toaster, and it feels a little bit like that.
Yeah. So I think the place that we are going, to kind of answer your question finally, where we are and where we're going, I think we're heading to a place where people are going to be experimenting with these different yield farming incentives.
Yep.
And we're going to find, through experimentation, we're going to find out what works, when it should actually be deployed, what kind of protocols. And then we're going to really zero in on like, okay, for each given protocol, what is the behavior we really want to see incentivized, and how do we avoid the pitfalls of just incentivizing completely useless.
I love what you're talking about, because one of the things I came up in conversation was this metaphor of farming, because I like to talk about like farming as an actual farm, is like digging in the dirt, and I think probably the most underappreciated organism in farming is actually nitrogen fixing bacteria. So you're like a biologist, so I can like jam on this with you, right? Which is bacteria, like decomposers, are actually like super important, right? And so the thing, why am I talking about this? What I'm talking about is I'm talking about transfer of energy, and I'm talking about biodiversity and ecosystems, right? And the thing that's amazing is that the winners are like the small guys, right? Like because when you look at, I have this thought experiment that I call the DOMP protocol. And basically the way it works is that some wag basically clones the comp smart contracts and then just shifts it to a different color coin called DOMP, right? And deliberately and abusively, right? So the day that happens, theoretically the incentives are for everyone who is farming comp to start farming DOMP. Right, because it has a greater increase in the value of the DOMP token, right? As a function of like, the chances of multiplying the DOMP token value by like 100,000x is better than taking the comp token today and multiplying that by 100,000x. Like, how could it possibly go much higher, right? Like it's impossible, right? It couldn't go 100,000x is what I'm saying, right? Whereas my DOMP token, could go like many, many times. So I guess what I'm saying is that like this performs an action kind of like tilling, right? Like you're turning the soil, and it's in a way it's just mixing, right? And the purpose of mixing is actually just decomposition, right? Like you want to take chunks of like fruit that fell down, and you want to take organic, maybe a hedgehog diet or whatever it is. You're just tilling everything under and like making better dirt, So I guess my question is doesn't, so when you talk about incentives, like, I'm talking about kind of the natural incentives that favor the small, right? That favor these small little bacteria and biodiversity, as opposed to favoring these large objects, which are just seen as energy vats that you can kind of digest or decompose, So I'm really kind of wondering, what the steady state will look like, if any, right? Or is this just an inherently volatile segment where, fortunes will just go up and down?
I think that's hard to answer. But in terms of what you're saying about, kind of like these sort of, the little guys kind of cooperating and, the soil tilling and mixing together, I think, one thing we are going to see is kind of an explosion in terms of yield farming composability. So I think one trend we're going to be seeing is kind of more ways to farm multiple tokens at the same time.
So you mean not just farming comp in a loop, but actually creating this loop that farms like 15 different things, and it like makes a super loop.
Yeah, I think that's one place that we're actually going, and like really I think like Yearn is sort of or YFI as they call it.
Yeah, Wi-Fi token. Yeah.
I think they're they move so quickly, but they are maxing out on composability in a way, and you can very quickly imagine how farming Wi-Fi ends up farming other things as well. And if you look at our token model, for instance, with our token, you stake it, you actually earn balancer rewards as a result. So yeah. So you're like providing liquidity to balancer. You're earning balancer trading fees. You're earning balancer tokens all at the same time while earning fees from our protocol and staking on our protocol. And so you can kind of imagine that there can be layers to it. And that's just one step. And you can imagine with Wi-Fi, they're using Curve and all of that. You can imagine that Curve tokens make an appearance in the mix, and so you're farming Wi-Fi while you're farming Curve, and and this is already like sort of a rebalancer. So eventually these rebalancers are going to be probably like yield farming rebalancers.
Do you see kind of these meta like aggregators, for example? I had Nodar Janashia from Zapper on, and there's also things like Instadap. Like, do you see these kind of like interfaces being a player in this context of like doing these kind of hyper multi-farm protocols, or is it more going to be kind of providers, right? Is it going to be aggregators or kind of? And it's a gray area, right?
It's going to be both. So like for Yearn is kind of is like really fast, move things and break things while stacking up multiple levels of kind of shaky composability and testing in production, and that's fine. We need diversity. We need different approaches. We're also seeing other people. So Acropolis recently released Delphi.
Yep.
And Delphi is essentially like Yearn in some ways, but it's already it's already like yield aware. So it's a rebalancer that's already trying to get you into the best lending opportunities and best yield opportunities, while also considering what kind of tokens you're going to get and the yield part of it. I don't think Yearn is quite there yet, but they're doing that, and they're focusing more on security. So I think we're going to see basically, Yearn, we're going to see Delphi taking different approaches, some slow, some faster, kind of these rebalancers for yield earning. And then on top of that, we're going to see interfaces like Instadap, like Zerion, and all of that, like Zapper, that basically like maybe utilize that, plus maybe utilize some more advanced strategies or very specific strategies. So, you see with like Instadapp right now, they kind of have this like comp max farming loop. So you can imagine that, they could be making use of providers like Yearn, like Delphi, and at the same time, also providing riskier strategies or more elaborate strategies. So I think that's kind of like how the layers are going to kind of like arrange themselves as we see this yield farming craze advance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating watching the evolution of these different layers. And, I think that there's a quote which is like, great artists steal, right? So there's definitely like a lot of this kind of inspiration going on. There's even some amount of kind of self-cannibalization going on. If you look at what Comp did with like C token, right? In a sense, like they kind of are just one-upping themselves, and I think that obviously you're seeing these layers of kind of inspiration that kind of enable people to kind of get meta, right? Like what you're seeing with something like YFI. So what's your take on kind of the YFI governance token? That thing's been a rocket ship and very mysterious.
Very mysterious indeed. Sort of cautiously optimistic, I suppose. Um, the Wi-Fi ecosystem is so complex in a way, and wrapping your head fully around it and all the implications. I think most people are at the stage where they understand how it works. They understand these three different pools, and then Yearn, and then the Y curve tokens, and then and then these different tiers of governance pools. And they've wrapped their head around that, and they understand that, I think some things that are more esoteric or like people are not appreciating as much as it is sort of like the intensity of the feedback loops that are at play, because like the rewards are paid out in the Wi-Fi token itself.
Yep.
So like the APR is in the Wi-Fi token, but then people are seeing that high APR, which is causing them to buy more of it, which is causing it to look like the APR is higher, which is causing them to buy more of it, which is kind of like causing this virtuous cycle in a way, but also in a way that's not clearly tethered to cash flows. So I'm not sure that like, I think what we really need to know is like, what are the cash flows for Wi-Fi? What is the, do the discounted cash flow analysis, give me a reasonable PE value. What is the fair market price for Wi-Fi? And then where are we going from there? And, I think there's some worry that I had that these positive feedback loops are sort of disconnected from that fundamental evaluation, and it will find it eventually, but that could cause like sort of a feedback loop in the other direction where the token starts dropping and then the yields appear to start dropping, which causes a mass exodus. And then it's not a Ponzi in the sense that, there are cash flows, there are real assets, but, there are some Ponzi-nomics, I guess you could say, at play. There's these very intense feedback loops that are not directly tied to the cash flow. I think, the market will find a price for it eventually. So it's not a Ponzi in the sense that, people are going like, the early investors are paying out the former investors.
No. There's no actual kind of pure deception, right? Like
there's no deception. It's just you look at the mechanism design and you kind of worry that is it the most efficient way of finding the price like at equilibrium as soon as possible? Is that why it's zooming up so quickly?
No. The reason why it's zooming up is that people want to vote on improvement protocols. Like they're super excited to vote on the governance. They want. I'm just joking.
I was like, really?
that is not why people are buying
Yeah, so I guess like my concern is that the mechanisms are really great for causing very strong feedback loops up and down, but maybe the kind of mechanism design we want to see is very efficient price discovery rather than like very efficient hype bubbles in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's so fascinating is absolutely the word you use, which I like, is this kind of experimental phase, right? And that the thing that's so interesting is that like what we're seeing here are the evolution. We're seeing evolution in action, right? And the thing that's fascinating about this stage of evolution is that we're evolving such foundational structures, right? Like it's like organisms inventing stuff like teeth, or inventing stuff like ears, like it's like, oh, the first organism with teeth, so it's such a crazy time, right? Because
it can bring an explosion.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And it's kind of like, oh, I wonder what teeth are going to do, in this space, in 10 years, like I bet there's a bright future for teeth, and the thing that's funny, if you say it's a bright future for teeth, like it's not clear that the progenitor organism is going to survive. It's more that like successor organisms may show up and be like, oh, I'm going to have teeth, like I'm going to use that mechanic, and it's so interesting because the unless there's some kind of durable network effects or moat, it's not even clear that kind of like one of the traditional things in finance is that as you increase in size, that the cost of capital decreases, right? And then as a function of size, you can actually maintain your position. But what's really funny about like DeFi incentivization is that it's not entirely clear that size is actually adaptive, right? Like if you look at kind of evolution from the perspective of the dinosaurs, like there was a moment in evolutionary history where being of size was actually not very advantageous, so that's a really interesting kind of thing to try to understand.
I think there's a clear difference between the network effects of certain DeFi applications like Balancer, like Uniswap, where like liquidity farming does build up these network effects that reduce spreads and increase trading volume and all of that. Whereas with say maybe like lending protocols or something, there's not exactly this clear network effect. Just because comp is bigger in size or Aave is bigger in size, it doesn't mean that this is like a clear moat. The one thing I will say is that insofar as there is a moat, it's probably has to do with borrowers and just like the switching costs of borrowing. In terms of like attracting capital and lending capital, they're largely commoditized. They're very fickle. They're often putting their funds in things like rebalancers that just move from one yield to the next.
Yep.
Whereas borrowers, it's just more difficult to move from one to another. And then increasingly there's becoming origination fees.
I like this because my way of looking at it is one of the things you're going to notice when you kind of start mapping the kind of contract sizes is that you're going to start seeing this classic power law distribution, right? Which really, because of the sort of Pareto principle, like you're actually going to see the majority of the volume in kind of the super whale sized contracts, right? So from that perspective, like participants in the network like that are really actually looking for kind of very stable interfaces, and they're looking for kind of things to push into to kind of use their kind of like size and power. So
and they're encountering costs that in the borrowing process that lenders aren't really encountering. So like
right.
You borrow on Aave, if you borrow on Comp, you're like paying some small origination fee, right?
Yep.
And if you try to move over to another protocol, you're getting hit with that fee again.
Yeah.
And so it needs to and then on top of that, if you have a large amount of capital, then you'll need a flash loan. And so it might not, depending on what asset you're moving, that flash loan might cost money. So you have very concrete and substantial switching costs for borrowers, whereas you don't have concrete and substantial switching costs for lenders. But as flash loans proliferate and more competition is around that, people will be building like refinance bridges and all of that. That will sort of more and more even out the playing field. And then it's going to be more about who can offer like the best price discovery for rates, or
Yeah.
incentivize better rates via various mechanisms. And this kind of brings me to a next point, which is that like this field moves so quickly
Yeah.
that like we had a product idea in mind that we had been calling Archimedes. And essentially the idea behind Archimedes was that we figured out a better way to achieve price discovery for both lenders and borrowers, so that it would always be better than Aave, it would always be better than Comp. It could always offer the absolute best rate for both lenders and borrowers. But the crazy thing is, after this yield farming came out, it became such a massive distortion to the rates.
Yes.
Like people aren't even really looking at that anymore.
Yeah.
It's just like, and this sort of distortion is like going to be so long lived for years at a time, that it almost made this product, which in theory is the everything killer, makes it maybe like non-viable for many years to come.
Yeah. It's a bit like someone who's like, oh, you know what I really like is a credit card that I get like mileage points, and like, I'm willing to pay like a 2,000% APR, so I can get mileage points, like people are really obsessing about like the yield farming aspect. It's very bizarre.
Yeah. So yeah, the way it's going, it's definitely shaping which products can come out and be dominant and be viable. And the ecosystem is going to be kind of sidetracked in this yield farming for a while. And I do think to some extent it is going to be a detriment to like the real use and economic efficiency of it if we're not like narrowing down on improving price discovery, improving economic efficiency, and we kind of have to wait it out. Like, I guess you could say is, like, in some ways it could be viewed like dumping, in a way where, some big company just keeps selling at a really low price over and over and over again until it just sort of.
But I think, but the ironic thing is that the mechanism actually favors smaller organizations doing that, as opposed to the bigger ones.
Yeah, it does, but it also like it. So it can be viewed like that in some ways, right? But in other ways, it's not similar. And so I think that it's what it does do is it forces everyone to offer something similar.
Yes,
and
totally
that's
agree.
totally possible. But there is like with that protocol we were talking about, Archimedes, we do feel like there is something lost in not having this out there, not being able to connect lenders and borrowers at exactly the market clearing price. Because right now, like lending and borrowing, if you took yield farming away, it has pretty large spreads.
Yes.
Right. And like if we were really moving forward in a way that like substantively improves the protocols, then that would be a very important route that we would be going down. But in light of like all this turbulence and all these incentive mechanisms, it's not as important anymore. Nobody would get that excited. They're like, oh wow, so your lenders get 1% more and your borrowers get 1% less.
Yeah.
That's not amazing anymore.
No.
Nobody cares about the rates. They're like, whatever. How much am I making?
Yeah, agree. It's pretty amazing. So I guess in terms of like the near term roadmap, like what's up for BZX? Tell us what's coming down the pike.
Yeah, so right now we're working on our audits. We took down the protocol earlier in February. At the beginning of the year, we were the fastest growing protocol in DeFi.
Yep.
And then, there were some incidents that everybody knows about.
Sure.
We took down the protocol. We are getting a 12-person week audit from PeckShield, who is, they did one of the multi-collateral DAI audits, and 12 weeks is like very much on the upper end of the scale in terms of person weeks for audits. We're getting an audit by Certic, who does great work, has done a lot of great audits in the past. And we're also getting formal verification done by them. Kind of following up as we get past the relaunch, we're going to be putting in a few new features. So, like for the relaunch, you can expect exciting features like vastly decreased gas usage,
Cool.
cheap token, so somewhat subsidized gas. Right now, gas is kind of like a hot topic, and we're really glad that we invested a lot of time in that.
Yeah.
Collateral management, order history, all of that, all of these things are going to be in the release. And then moving past that, we're going to be doing more audits. So we're hoping to get an open Zeppelin audit. So we have a few like BZIPs, BZX improvement proposals
Yep.
that we kind of want to add. And then we want to, after we get those in, we'd like to get a full audit by open Zeppelin on the full thing again. And then we'd also like to get a economic audit by Gauntlet. So like a
Cool.
general market risk assessment, liquidations, both solvency and liquidity of the various parameters of the protocol and the different assets that we're adding. We would like to take the title of most audited protocol.
Yeah.
And we're intending to offer a very large bounty program. So it's our intention to kind of go from zero to hero. You could call it overcompensating or whatever you like, but we've had a terrible experience with the attacks, and we never want it to happen again.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I very much appreciate that.
so we're very much like putting it into gear 110%. If this much auditing was good before, where's my hand? We want it to be this much. We want to go so overboard with the security that there can really be no question that we've learned a lot and our protocol is very secure. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah. I mean, it's the metaphor that I was giving before about this kind of like bacteria metaphor, right? Like in a way, like all organisms are just looking to kind of get energy, right? And if they can get the energy from another organism, they're like kind of happy to do so, right? And so in a way, like if a larger organism somehow expires, right, then the bacteria are just all over it. They're just like, yeah, I just want to get that energy. And so I totally absolutely understand, right? It's super important to kind of like make sure you're going out, and I think people are forgiving in this market. I think that it's a very permissive market, and I feel like you're doing a lot of the right things, and it feels like a pretty exciting time for BZX.
Yeah, and another thing I didn't cover is we had the attack. We had our IE pool become somewhat insolvent, and we've launched a series of initiatives to fix that, to make everybody whole. So one thing you'll notice is that there's never like a single person you'll find on the forums, on Reddit or anything that says, "Hey, I lost money using BZX." That's
Cool.
like that is like our entire goal. So, even though, sometimes people bring it up to kind of, be like, hey, watch out for these guys, you'll never find one of them going, and I lost money, because we made sure to take care of every single person. We're giving them multiple ways out, multiple options. So one thing we did is, we created this token model, which is a huge improvement. We're doing this thing with the liquidity mining that we think is really fun, which is we took like the tokens that are going to be used as the liquidity mining incentives, and we wrapped them in a vesting contract. So you can kind of see that, like with maybe Balancer, Compound, they're continuously emitting tokens, which is like continuously causing sell pressure, which is continuously, making it less attractive
Yeah.
to participate in the yield farming, because it is supposed to be like there's these feedback loops embedded in it. And
Yeah.
so we created these vesting tokens
Oh, I
that
love that.
align people more in the long term with the protocol. And we gave the people who suffered from downtime, either like as traders or as lenders, we said, hey, here's the deal. We're going to give you these vesting tokens at a rate that is significantly below market. It's an extremely square deal. You're going to come out better than if you had like not been subject to any of this in the first place. So what we're doing is like we're not just making people whole, we're making people more than whole, and in a way that kind of fosters long-term alignment with our protocol. And so I think that this is something very interesting we're doing that maybe is not talked about that much. Like, how do you recover? Like, and we're not going to be the last ones that have a question of how do you recover. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of money lost that where nobody has tried to recover. They just say, hey, this is DeFi and things happen. But
Right.
for us, we don't have that attitude. We're not like, oh, you should know better, take responsibility. We say, hey, if we want DeFi to go mainstream, we need to be there. We need to be taking responsibility. We need to say, if you lost money, we will take responsibility for you, and we will be there and we'll make you whole. We have your back.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that there's definitely a bright future for that kind of an attitude, right? Because I feel like if people get too hardcore into like code is law, then you start getting into like people just start draining contracts, and it's the Wild West, right? It's basically just people shooting from the hip, and that's not a way to build a financial infrastructure.
And I think the problem with this entire like code is law discussion is that this was imported from level 1 discussions about the consensus of Ethereum, about the consensus mechanisms for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So people are taking this meme and transplanting it to a completely different context where it doesn't apply at all. We are trying to build consumer-facing applications. What are you talking about?
Right.
Code is law.
Yeah, agree. And so much commerce takes place outside of kind of like strict commercial contracts, and so like the reality is that this stuff does matter, and people do matter, and how people are treated matters. So I really appreciate that perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I hope we see a sort of mental shift among other people in DeFi where they're not like so willing to just fall back on code is law when it's almost a non sequitur. Like, are you taking care of your customers or not?
Yeah, that's great. To me, like, there's the decentralized part, which of course is wonderful, but there's always the finance part, and finance is finance. People need to kind of like deal with it in a better way. I mean, obviously, like I wouldn't be excited about this space if I didn't think that there was a very big aching need for alternative and more decentralized financial infrastructure, but at the same time, like it isn't about kind of absconding with like a whole bunch of money, like obviously some of the problems with over centralization have resulted in like, essentially privatized gains and socialized losses, and this kind of like malfeasance, right? So that, should we try to recreate a completely different ethos of like, it's sort of this, might makes right. I think that's not what the whole thing it should be about.
Yeah. So like, I wouldn't have a problem with people saying code is law if after like the BZX attack, we got on Twitter and said the miners need to reverse that transaction. We need to undo it at the consensus level. If somebody was making that argument, we would say, okay, that's really going down a dangerous path. The DAO, the reason this even came up during the DAO was because there was like this fork, and it like we never stop hearing about it. When you mess with the consensus, that is where I'm fine having the code is law argument. But I think lost funds and whatnot should be handled at the application layer, should be handled at the protocol layer, where the protocols hopefully in a decentralized way say, hey, if you use our protocol, we have your back. And that that has nothing to do with code is law. If the DAO makes one decision or doesn't make one decision, it's still the underlying code being executed faithfully. Like at that point, it's a completely social issue, and we just need to be aware of social realities and kind of make our plans based on what is best for the ecosystem and what's best for mainstream adoption.
Yeah, this is wonderful. And to me, I think we're all in We unfortunately or fortunately are in a phase of kind of the Wild West at the moment in DeFi. And so I think that kind of establishing the ground rules of this emerging civilization and culture is pretty important. So I appreciate your leadership and being outspoken on this topic. So, this has been a really great time. Really enjoyed speaking with you, and thanks so much. Any kind of parting words of wisdom?
Parting words of wisdom. No, I don't.
Yeah, that's fine. You don't need to. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope to have you on again, and really excited about these upcoming relaunch events. So, I'm excited to see what happens with BZX.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Miko. It's been an absolute pleasure being on the show.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Okay, bye.
MikoBits.